Hello and welcome to our second Ecsite online webinar. I'm Brad Irwin and I'm part of the Ecsite Annual Conference Committee who have pulled together this series of webinars which cover a really important range of topics vital to our community. Ecsite Online is an opportunity to interact digitally since we cannot meet in Ljubljana. And it's thanks to Ecsite members that we have this incredible series of webinars, a very special day celebrating Ecsite on the 11th of June, and a Focus Business Day on the 19th of June. And all of these events are free to join and accessible to all. To find out more about Ecsite Online, please click the green button below, and if you'll be sharing the webinar on social media afterwards, please use the hashtag #EcsiteOnline. Now, on to today's webinar. First of all, I should say hello to our convener today, a very well-known face at Ecsite, a keen collector of Ecsite tote bags, and the previous chair of the Rev Group, Marie Hobson. Marie, how are you?
I'm fine, Brad, thank you. How are you?
I'm not bad at all. I see you've got a bit of a friend with you in your background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the Audience Research and Advocacy Manager at the Natural History Museum in London in the UK. We're very well known for our dinosaurs, so I am trying to recreate a little bit of that museum vibe in my home office, formerly known.
And do I see a touch of Ecsite around its waist or middle?
Absolutely. I think we all know one of the highlights of Ecsite is the tote bag. So I've got a selection of tote bags adorning my dinosaur to add that Ecsite flavour.
A lovely touch. Now, Marie, I think it's fair to say that understanding our audiences has become even more important than ever before. So, Marie, why don't you just tell us a little bit about today's session?
Sure. So I think one of the things this crisis has shown us more than ever is that visitors are vital to the survival of our organisations. So, of course, for many years, we have been putting visitors at the heart of our institutions, but never has that been more important than today. And never has it been more important to understand the needs, wants, expectations of our visitors through audience research. But audience research is really difficult right now. We don't have any visitors. Some of us don't have staff. We don't have budgets. So how can we do audience research during a pandemic? So as I was thinking about what we could do with my team at the Natural History Museum, I had so many questions and thoughts and concerns. And essentially this session's been born out of those, really, because I can't be the only person thinking these things. So I'm hoping that with our co-presenters, we can share some of our questions and some of our resources, experiences and answers with the wider group.
That sounds great. And we should let our audience know that this webinar will be about an hour long, and we really want people to ask questions in the Q&A box below. But more importantly, make sure you upvote other questions so that we can ensure we tackle the most important to us as a community. So please put your questions in the box below, and Marie and the speakers will get to them throughout the session. So with all that said and done, Marie, I'm going to hand over to you.
Great, thanks, Brad. So one of the things we've been hearing a lot in the pandemic is this spirit of sharing and collaboration and the need for that at these times. So in that spirit, we are sharing our thoughts and experiences and the resources that we've come across at this time. At the end of this webinar, we will put a link to our Google Drive, and in there you will find links to a lot of the sentiment trackers, the advice and guidance around reopening, top tips for online focus groups and other audience research related webinars. All of this will be available to you at the link at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I want to talk about 3 focus areas. So firstly, what audience research is already available to us. There's a lot out there and we're going to be talking and sharing a lot of that with you. We're also going to hear from Volker from a museum that reopened last week. So that's super exciting. We're then going to think about what do we need to consider when conducting audience research right now. And Jeremy will be talking to us a lot about those kind of ethical considerations that are so pertinent at this time. And then finally, thinking a little bit around what is the near future for audience research? What does this look like? So there's a lot of information actually out there, and what I've been particularly pleased about and pleasantly surprised by is the number of research agencies who are conducting audience research right now and sharing it free of charge, often through weekly updates and webinars. I've linked to all of these in the Google Drive. These are a selection I've come across, and in that spirit of sharing, if there's any I've missed that you know about, please do add it into the chat so we can update the document accordingly. So a lot of these sentiment trackers are looking at how the populations of various countries feel about the virus, how concerned they are about it, their propensity to return to museums and what would make them feel safer to do so, their travel plans, and also their current behaviours. So do check out these sentiment trackers. It's really useful to kind of frame your thinking. In addition, lots of organisations have been mapping when organisations are reopening. So Nemo, for example, has put this map together of when European sites are reopening. And Ben Mellum on Twitter has also convened a selection of reopening plans and the health and safety procedures that these museums have been put in place. And he's doing weekly updates. He's also doing a webinar this afternoon at 4 p.m. British summertime, if you want to check that out. There's all sorts of different webinars exploring what the future might look like from an operational and visitor experience perspective. And again, we've linked to some of these in the Google Drive, so do check those out. From those sentiment trackers, from those webinars that I've been attending, the key findings here seem to be that there are a lot of concerns about revisiting visitor attractions, with some countries more concerned than others. So the UK, Italy and Spain seem to have particularly concerned populations at the moment, with Australians and Germans a little bit more keen to return to normal. In a recent ALVA survey of the UK population, around 70% of visitors did express concern about returning to museums and galleries, and a quarter said they would feel a lot more anxious about doing so. The greatest concerns seem to be around obvious ways in which the virus can spread, so through physical contact and the close proximity of people. And when asked to rank a range of different priorities about returning to venues, a safe environment was the highest ranked priority. So the public seem to be particularly concerned about overcrowding and the ability to actually be able to maintain social distancing on site. They need to be reassured about what the museum is doing and to see it in practice. It's not enough just to communicate it on our websites and social media, points of purchase and so on, but they actually want to see staff wearing PPE and the cleaning happening around the site as well. So based on this, at the Natural History Museum, we've been really trying to think about what that means for us. We have a visitor charter, which you can see on the column in bold on the left. That's our visitor charter. And what we've had to do is adapt that and think about that. What does this mean in the time of COVID? Really framing that thinking are three key questions. So what do we need to do to keep our staff safe? What do we need to do to keep our visitors safe? And what do we need to do to help our visitors feel safe? From the sentiment trackers, the things that would reassure visitors seem to be staff wearing PPE, particularly in catering outlets, and potentially protected by perspex screens. They want hand sanitizer at the entrances, but also throughout the site where appropriate, so toilets, interactives, etc. They want visible, frequent cleaning regimes, and they want us to limit numbers to be able to enforce social distancing. So they are expecting things like timed entry, floor markings, one-way systems, and those sorts of things to be in place. They want to go cashless, but they also want a warm welcome from staff. I think we need to also remember it. You know, this all sounds very clinical, and people are concerned. So, and they've also been socially isolating. So it is very important that within all of this context, we do remember to offer a warm welcome back from our staff. Some museums have started to ask their visitors about what they want to see from their sites. For example, the National Museums in Liverpool. So that's something you could consider. But today we want to bring Volker into the presentation. Volker is a visitor researcher from the Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin. And his museum actually opened last week. So he's going to talk to us a little bit about what considerations they put in place and how he's going to be conducting visitor studies with actual visitors back on site. Over to you, Volker.
Hello, everybody. I hope you hear me. I'm talking about the situation in the Museum for Naturkunde in Berlin. We just opened last week. And for us, it was the main objective for us was the elevation of the situation of the visitors. Some aspects, for example, providing a positive visitor experience. So, as Mary talked about, feel comfortable and safe. Controlling the situation beforehand, we are limiting the numbers of visitors to a maximum of 600 visitors throughout the day. And we also introduce online ticketing. This is the only way to acquire tickets. And we also introduce time slots. So to avoid any crowded audiences in our house. Then informing our visitors of our restrictions. For example, social distance control, wearing masks. They have to bring their mask with themselves, and that our interactive stations are closed, as well as parts of our exhibition. Next, we are interested in is identifying and considering the specific needs, for example, of individual visitors, of families. There are a lot of families in our house at the moment, especially with small children, and for people with handicap. Okay, the next slide, please. Here's a short impression of normal visitor research in our house. We are normally using computer tablets for our surveys, and we do about 3,500 a year. It was a nice time with no social distance. Right, to the next, please. Okay. Our visitor survey will take part shortly after the reopening. So in the next days, we start our survey. So we are interested in exploring how visitors perceive the museum visit in general, how they feel in our house, about the acceptance of the restrictions, for example, the safety measures, and in general, the experience of the visit, how visitors feel, the identification of improvement opportunities for us, then also about the awareness and use of digital offers, awareness and interest in outreach programs. And it's also about the acceptance of many interactive or multimedia stations because they are all closed, and also about the acceptance because many parts of our museum of our exhibition is also closed off, how they accept it. So who is coming and why? We are really interested in the visitor structure at the situation, about our regular visitors, and also about our regional visitors, because we expect a massive decrease of tourists from Germany, from the different federal states, as well as from abroad. So we have to fill this gap with other visitors. Right. Next slide, please. Mary? Yeah, okay, thanks, Mary. It's a bit blurred, but it's about our visitor survey, and you can see above about the methodology, and it is we use paper and pencil questionnaires. We hope to achieve 200 to 300 questionnaires during a 6-day survey. Thirdly, We use a lot of open questions just to gather some individual or personal responses of our visitors to these really special situations. And we try to do the data analysis within 2 weeks, just to cater rapid information and just to enable our senior staff to any implementations by our results. Is this about our visitor characteristics right above? For example, of the modality of the visit, family with kids, or you can see on the right side above, motivation to visit. What are the reasons to visit after the reopening? This is, for example, an open question. And also we asking on the down, on the right side down, a visitor's experience. So experience of the visit, how they feel during their visit. It's an open question. The duration of the visit and about the safety. It's a feeling of safe and well looked after. Then on the bottom left, acceptance, for example, safety measures. So the regulated inlet on site, or the obligations to wear mask, regulation of social distance. And then we also ask for the assessment by visitors about the feeling of safety, well-being, and also about their personal recommendations for a visit under these circumstances. And some other aspects, for example, about our widened digital offers. We do a lot to increase these offers, and also about our public relation, how to inform the public about our house and our reopening. All right, so the last slide, please, Mary. Thank you. Okay, the visitor survey. I'm really keen that it's relevant and for a short and long-term goals. For example, how to get along with the decrease of tourists, national and international. Here in focus, our regional visitors from Berlin and from the surrounding federal state Brandenburg. Visitor potentials in the near future. How to attract visitors from Berlin and how to attract regular visitors to come again and again. Attracting families, especially families with small children. And then another potentials, for example, how about our students? Berlin has lots of universities in town, and how to motivate them to visit us. Attracting previous non-visitors, for example, people who prefer sport and leisure events. Maybe they have time now to come to us because all these events are closed. And also thinking about programs during summer holidays. And yeah, there are some responses to think that many visitors like it to come to an empty and more silent museums, because our museum at the moment is not crowded, you can't see it. And so, exploring the potential of new, also not really new offers and formats, for example, the digital offers and different kinds of outreach programs. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Volker. So we've got some questions coming in. So don't forget, guys, to add your questions to the Q&A and vote for the ones you most want answered. I think for context, Volker, it'd be really helpful if you could let us know how many visitors do you normally get to your site, so we can get a sense of the reduction you're seeing. So how many visitors do you normally get?
And on crowded days, we got a number of 10,000 visitors a day, but on normal days it's more about 4,000 or 5,000, and now 600. And at the last weekend, we achieved about 600, but in the last days it was a couple of hundred. So it's really regulated, it's not crowded, and so the safety and safety measures is not a problem for our visitor. So it's a massive reduction of our visitors.
Absolutely. And what sort of square meterage are you allowing for your visitors for social distancing?
15 square meters.
Okay, great. Another question that keeps coming up is what are you doing about your toilets? That seems to be the tricky area to sort of police. What are you doing about your washrooms?
Yes, we have some tables before the doors of our toilets, and so the people can clean their hands. And what I expected is not the case, and because there are not so many visitors, so the toilets are not crowded. It's not a problem to control the entrance of the toilet. So they have
Great.
the opportunity to wash their hands or to clean their hands with disinfectants.
Hmm. And how are you dealing with your interactives or any kind of hands-on exhibits?
Yeah, unfortunately they are all absolutely closed.
Okay.
They are really, everything is closed, and also some
Hmm.
parts of the exhibition, because some parts are not. We can't really offer them to the public because it is not in line with the security measures.
Sure. So you mentioned a lot of your offer is going online, going digital. There's a question around, have you had any thoughts around monetizing those virtual online experiences?
No, this not at the moment. It's not the case.
And kind of what's the thinking about that? Are you thinking kind of, to offer access to people? Is that the kind of the idea?
Or can you didn't I get the question? Can you say it again, please?
And what is, I guess, what's the thinking behind making sure that that is for free? Is that to compensate for the lack of physical visitors and to improve access?
Yes, to give the interested people just a way just to experience the museum as far as is possible with the digital offerings. Yes, and some
Yeah.
new kind of digital offerings for our from our guides, for example, that they make little small movies about certain animals or some certain dinosaurs, and telling some nice stories about it.
Hmm. And have you had, how have the visitors responded to reopening? I know you haven't done your survey yet, but have you had any kind of backlash from people in terms of people thinking you've opened too early, for example?
No, there's a big. I have been in the museum today, and I was
Mhm.
talking with our security personnel, and they really told us there's no problem. So it's not crowded, so it's not a problem. And the people, they really appreciate all these safety measures for their safety, and
Mhm.
there are no problems, and it's a big understanding that not everything is open now at the moment. So, for example, the interactive stations and multimedia
Mm,
stations. So it's at the moment it's a general acceptance.
great. And have you had any contact with teachers and schools? Are they wanting to come back and visit at any point soon?
No, there is no, actually not. It is a
Mm.
big understanding, and we are talking about every week. And sometimes there is a teacher, and he is a bit pressing, but
Mhm.
it's not normal. Normally not. No, no. At the moment in Germany, it is a real big acceptance of the measures, of the
Mhm.
safety measures.
So, thinking now a little bit about your audience research specifically, why did you decide to use paper-based questionnaires rather than, say, an email or an online survey or something of that nature?
Now the thing is, we really want to ask the people within the situation, in the actual situation, just to keep them and ask them in this situation. And we use paper and pencil because we don't want to use any touch screens or whatever, like
Mhm.
our computer tablets, because of the safety. And they have also a pen, for example, and they can take it with them. It's the logo of the museum on it, just
Mhm.
to avoid any touching points, so to say. And
Mhm.
so this is the reason. And I'm really convinced, and we have to ask the people in the situation and not online, because people in this museum and people online are different groups.
Yeah, and I guess related to that, how are you coping with sort of sampling and your sampling strategy and strike rates and things like that?
Okay, we accept it is maybe not representative, but we can uh, um, now get some information and also get the impressions and personal impressions of our visitors. So this is the reason why we use a lot of open questions, just to have an insight in our visitors and how they accept it and how they experience the visit at the moment and how they feel at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And have you had any, are you planning to do any kind of more face-to-face interviews, but obviously kind of with a social distancing element?
Not at the moment, but I think also I'm thinking about it just to have talks with our security personnel, to have the systematic survey and ask them how the visitors react. But it will, if all these measures and restrictions will last, we will use maybe some face-to-face interviews. Yeah.
Great. Does your museum have a admission charge?
Yes, in normal charge. It's normal, and it's only online ticketing. There are no our cashiers are closed, and you have to have your valid online ticket. This is the only way to come to our museum.
Have you offered any kind of discount on the price, given not not the full experience is not
No, it's not. And I'm not sure, but it is also technically is not possible at the moment.
Sure. So there's lots more questions coming in for Volker, but I'm anxious we get through the rest of our slides. We will come back to a general Q&A at the end of the session. So do please keep your questions coming in on the Q&A and do vote for the ones you most want answered. Any that we can't answer today in the time we've got, we will endeavour to follow up with afterwards. So now I'd like us to turn our attention to what we can do in terms of audience research now, and what are those considerations. And I'm going to invite Jeremy to join us. So I first met Jeremy through another webinar that he gave, where he said, audience research in a time of crisis, don't do it. And I always love people who tell me not to do my job. So so thanks for that. So to elaborate on that theme, Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you. And if we can pull up and focus on the presentation as you can, Brad. I want to make sure we have that up. And just for the record, while we're doing that, I am also an evaluator. So whenever I'm saying, suggesting to people that they do not do audience research or are very careful about it in any case, it affects me too. This is not a one-way thing. As I said, I'm Jeremy Fouts, principal of STEAM Work Group, a cultural arts and research evaluation consulting company based in Indianapolis, Indiana, that helps organizations with data collection, analysis, and interpretation, as well as program design and strategic planning. I use research and evaluation approaches in STEM fields, as well as education, ethnomusicology, sociology, and anthropology to help groups find the right questions as well as answers. In many cases, this takes us beyond standard evaluations. Since this discussion has its roots in values, equity, and compassion, it's especially important to acknowledge that my part of this meeting here in Indiana, in the US, is being held on the traditional lands of the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee peoples. Even though the state of Indiana has only recognized 2 of these groups with any land repatriation at all, I pay my respect to all their elders, both past and present. More importantly, almost, I encourage you to hear from the groups themselves instead of me. And 2 such sources in Indiana are on your screen, www.miamiindians.org and pokagonband-nsn.gov. This topic in audience research and in monitoring and evaluation in general resonates with me because of my background in education and ethnomusicology. Both involve working with peoples in stages of trauma and pain, people under siege by fear, poverty, political forces, and many other factors outside of their control. These factors were largely unseen, and they were everywhere, which in many sad ways relates directly to this context that we find ourselves in. I'm not the expert, and anyone who claims to know exactly how to navigate these times is very likely who we all should avoid. Kind of like if you know the Tao, that is not the Tao. The thoughts I've gathered here are a very brief distillation of what I've read and heard from organizations I respect and trust, as well as some that I've grown to distrust. My first reaction to this question is to completely avoid, as Marie said, direct visitor research, remedial and summative, and instead focus on inward-facing evaluation work, valuability assessments, developmental and formative evaluation, and capacity building, which is why you have on your screen my Lord of the Rings post, which says, "Abandon your post, flee for your lives," scene from The Fall of Gondor, which isn't as dire here as that might initially suggest. Even with this inward-facing work, this isn't to say that it should not meaningfully involve external stakeholders. It most definitely should, but that's another topic. My point here is that engagement and relationships are different in summative studies than developmental studies, for example. But in all seriousness, I suggest we frame this discussion through some foundational evaluation terms. I see opportunity here when we think back to the title of the webinar, yet I also see significant obstacles with how the status quo, or slow decay really, of some informal learning organizations and research companies do their work. In some respects, I'm framing this as evaluation ethics. But what I'm trying to show is that the interaction between ethics and evaluation. It helps me to consider ethics as encompassing three large elements. For those that may be unfamiliar with these terms, or that sometimes have to refresh, axiology is the values of the evaluation in our context, or put another way, what purpose is the evaluation serving? My stance, and the stance of a growing number in the field, is that it should serve equity and be visitor-facing. That may seem obvious to some, but when it comes to practice, how often is it simply not the case? And our research evaluation questions primarily are for the funder or the museum. Ontology in this context is how our existence forms meaning making, which I relate to emic-etic parallels in ethnomusicology, sociology, and anthropology that allow and encourage multiple meanings that can coexist. It's not a zero-sum situation. Epistemology here involves what counts as knowledge. You can think of it as Foucault's archaeology of knowledge almost, which should certainly be a part of these conversations as evaluators, researchers, and data scientists. I would even go so far that axiology is on a higher plane in the hierarchy of things than ontology and epistemology, while still dialectically being influenced by each other. But that graphic becomes a mess, so I did this. The meeting of these foundations of evaluation is where we find, in my view, validity and reliability. If we don't consider these elements from the very beginning of designing the study, even making the request for the study, then not only is it more work to fix it later, it calls the validity and reliability of the study into question. Yes, a result or finding or even a model is created, but all of these are only as good as their foundations. So if we focus in on that center of those three elements, I'm suggesting that it kind of falls into 5 separate but very correlated elements here. And I'm suggesting we as evaluators position ourselves at that intersection, especially at this moment, which leads me to these. The purpose of the research and evaluation, balancing the many contexts and ontologies, for example, prioritizing our data needs, rebalancing all of that with access and privilege, and focusing on these elements with our methodologies. Here, when we talk about the purpose of the research and evaluation, I intentionally use the term exploring instead of determining to emphasize that all findings from the very beginning of the visitor research and evaluation process are snapshots in time and not rigidly defined or determined. This is, of course, always the case, as many of us know. But some of the people reading our reports and our findings and making the requests might not know that. So it's even more important to clarify this point to our stakeholders now, especially those without your expertise and experience. And just to note something in the chat, you will have the slides, so we've got it as big as we can given the platform. So as we explored usage, outcomes, and impacts for recently ended programs or online offerings, we still have to do something. Stakeholders of all kinds still need to know some of the findings for accountability, professional growth, resource allocation, program improvement, etc. There are ways to do that that are less, that ask less of the visitor or audience, but still take a lot of work from us at the organization level. Sometimes we're trying to learn the needs of our audience during the crisis, sometimes of vulnerable populations. But can we actually act on the findings in a meaningful way from the participants' perspective? Can we act quickly given the probable financial and personal strain on your organization? It might, that depends entirely on your context. You might be exploring the impact of the crisis for your audiences on mission-specific topics, whether it's the environment, etc. You might be, what lots of us are trying to do and being asked to do, is exploring the nature of museum life when we can safely gather together. That's some of what Volker is trying to do with his study. We have to be careful with that last one, though, unless you have both the extreme need for that prediction and the expertise to get it, because there's so many variables at play, as many of you have already noted in your questions. But it also takes a completely different design and analytic approach, inferential statistics versus the more common descriptive statistics. Data from the Washington Post and the University of Maryland, both respective data sources, last week shows that the timeline for safely gathering are changing, at least for this around 1,000 participant sample from the US. It shows a dramatic, it was pretty much even in April, and now in May, last week, it is sharply diverged. And as I said, this is just one study, one graph, okay, that's trying to summarize a very complicated and complex problem. But now we have this something happening here. What does this mean for all those intent to visit studies? How does your method deal with this very real and very latent hidden set of variables? How likely is it that group A will do behavior X? There's a large set of statisticians who have even gone so far as to say that probability, as commonly understood, doesn't exist, even when using the inferential statistics approach I mentioned previously. From the very beginning, how are we accounting for multiple ontologies and epistemologies as people figure out through their own being, their own existence, through their own evaluations of what counts as knowledge? How are we accounting for that? How are we practicing our values and axiologies? One of the ways I've tried to frame this is through balancing the multiple contexts at play. Even though I've experienced frustrations with institutional review boards, and maybe many of you have, their foundational purpose is to protect participants from harm, and this includes psychological harm. I'm not suggesting that everything we do go through IRBs, now or in the future, but I think we should be thinking of any potential harm, emotional as well as physical, that can occur by reaching out, even if we do it in good faith and with good intention. That's why I'm suggesting we practice compassion and consider the contexts of your audience or participants. For example, reminding vulnerable populations of their vulnerability, or asking them to expend emotional labor so that our organizations can understand systemic inequality is likely to do more harm than good. There are already many resources available on this front. Now imagine your grocery, your insurance company, your pet supply store, your bank, and your local arts and cultural organizations are all asking you in some very oddly familiar tones how you are doing, how you're trying to cope with things. And they're doing it all at once. And some of these places have supported systems of inequity against maybe you and your family. And it's you see where I'm going. And it's not anywhere we as museums want to go. This is not a talk about equitable evaluation, and I'm uncomfortable to say the least to claim any authority. That's why I'm strongly recommending discussing the equitable evaluation framework from the Equitable Evaluation Initiative. And I have the website of it on the screen, equitableeval.org. A link to their framing paper will also be included included in the Google Drive link. I'd start there, expand by following the Museums Are Not Neutral initiative on Twitter, started by Latanya Autry and Mike Murakowski. Excuse me. There are journal articles on this topic, but access is sometimes a problem for those too. That's why I'm suggesting starting here. I'm not going to sugarcoat it for most of us. In this predominantly white, highly educated field, especially in the US, this will be painfully challenging, but it's for a worthy purpose. And our visitors and communities will thank us for it. It will make us better as people and as organizations. And lastly here, I might suggest conducting an evaluability assessment to learn whether you have the capacity to do this work right now. And that is not only expertise, but also the relationships with the communities involved. Talking with your colleagues about their capacity and needs, and need is a strong word here, and we'll talk more about that later, will help shape the evolving scope. Two examples of this, of focusing on what you need to know versus what you want to know, are gender and socioeconomic status. It's sometimes good to know these things for some study outcomes, but is it always needed for a specific evaluation question? Is it needed because it's central to the ontological underpinnings of your study? In other words, are you or your funders really going to use that data? Consider future use and misunderstandings of that data and prioritize what you need to know now. For once, an evaluator is suggesting that you don't plan 1 to 5 years ahead. Enjoy. It is my gift to you. Really, though, we should be considering how and if the data we're collecting can be compared to past or future contexts. For example, timing and tracking studies should largely be put on hold, in my opinion, given the fact that movement patterns, interactive use, as already noted in the chat, gallery capacity, and our inherent states of being, just to name a few variables, are entirely different at this moment. Unless we're going to implement that data immediately, obviously following and observing visitors in potentially drastically altered gallery spaces just adds to the health and emotional risks. for the visitors and staff for no real productive purpose. Keeping the data requests small is also central. What can our audiences reasonably comment on right now? What is it ethical to ask them about? Here I'm thinking about that icebreaker question I've seen so many times, how are you doing? While it's sometimes asked with good intentions, as I said before, it shows how in these times a simple question can invoke a familiar relationship that simply might not exist between you and your audience. Collectively, we're trying to make sense of the situation, make plans, and potentially just make it through the day, adding another cognitive load while ranking our 15 favorite programs or expeditions from the past year isn't going to help anyone. Even before the crisis, access and privilege influence results. We know this, and this happens despite attempts which vary, attempts at balance and living out our values in an organizational context. This is even more prevalent now. Though sometimes necessary, making so many things digital and online adds another layer of mediation to navigate, not just for us, the organizations, but also, of course, for our audience. Well, a month old, this data from nearly 5,000 US adults shows part of the problem. Devices and internet connection type. Here it's related to education writ large, since many of the schools in the US, as they have been around the world, have had to switch to distance learning, remote learning of some kind. The experience and outcomes will likely be fundamentally different between someone using a cell phone or a computer at home or on public Wi-Fi. Outside of the scope of this report and this presentation, there are also privacy concerns because of inequity and privilege. And a copy of this report will also be included in the materials. There's so much that we as a field need to do on this front, but here are 4 areas that I feel are vital at this time. Using participatory evaluation methods can help mitigate, that's the key word here, mitigate inequity and privilege. This can look like involving a small group of representative and compensated audience members, which offers another layer of validation and checks on our own perceptions and privilege. This is good practice in general, but it does take more time and energy from everyone. If it's approached with transparency and care, though, it will be well worth it, with stronger findings and stronger ties to your audience. I'd consider multiple meanings of the word access. For example, as the previous slide said, while internet access is widespread, some rural areas and even some places in cities lack coverage. But that's just one type, right? People with certain professions or multiple jobs, working as caregivers or homeschooling kids, it might not matter that they have a smartphone and a connection if they lack the time, energy, and just general emotional bandwidth. Did we test the instrument with screen reading software or present it in multiple languages depending on our contexts? Those are all types of access. Making sure that your instruments are mobile friendly and respect privacy is a key element here. Do not assume that a platform renders every question or renders it well or consistently on mobile devices or across mobile devices, because they do not. Additionally, many of the apps and platforms we can and do collect background data that is monetized by third parties. And for all practical purposes, this data is not anonymous, despite their claims. As researchers, we know better. We can triangulate identity, or at least enough about them, pretty quickly. This is another case of having researchers in the same room with software developers. Lastly, I would suggest that we revisit the equitable evaluation frameworks throughout the process. We do this not only to center ourselves, at least, again, this is from my point of view, to center ourselves to avoid slipping into old patterns. We make our values visible through all of this including the methodologies we use. For this final section of the webinar, Marie is going to share some of our collective thoughts, which will kind of continue to get us going. And I'm sure through the chat, I see all kinds of questions. This will come up in there as well. So off to you, Marie.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, so we just wanted to end on a kind of, what does the near future of audience research look like? How can we adapt our methods for this time period? We've heard from Volker about how he's trying to adapt an exit survey through a paper and pen method. Other options that we're considering at the Natural History Museum is what information can we collect at the point of purchase? We are free, but we are going to ticket our entry. So what vital, and thinking to Jeremy's point about what do we need to know versus want to know, at point of purchase, we have a visitor, sort of visitor number modeling simulation that we've put together. And so that's a lot of that is based on families versus adults, and it's based on geographic location. So that's the information that we will collect at the point of purchase, so to speak. But equally, we'd like to follow up with a post-visit email to people who come on site to address many of the things that Volker looked at in his survey. So around the kind of the satisfaction of the visitor experience in this slightly odd, strange time, and what people think to our health and safety measures. Interviewing, well, in the week of the lockdown, my colleagues and I were about to launch into 3 focus groups. So we had to pivot those into telephone interviews. And actually we found that the teachers we spoke to seemed very, very grateful and appreciative of the opportunity to talk about something that wasn't the virus. Of course, as Jeremy talked about, we had to think carefully about who it would be appropriate to interview at this time. But those teachers we spoke to, and this might be true of other people who are self-isolating, actually appreciated having that engagement with us. There are so many online methods that people can try now, online focus groups, online community panels, and we've put a guide, some of the top tips that people have started to share around length of time, number of people, activities you can do to inform how, and also some really popular platforms as well. So how you can do online focus groups. And actually some of the advantages of doing kind of online interviewing in this way is the fact you can still see people, see body language, build a rapport, but also present stimulus materials in a way that perhaps you couldn't through an ordinary telephone interview. I do think there'll be a rise in deliberative methods. Maybe there should be a rise in deliberative methods. So this is where you have almost like a citizen jury. So a kind of longer in-depth relationship with your visitors, with your participants to co-develop kind of policies, procedures and things like that. So it's a much more kind of equitable and sharing of decision-making. And finally, prototype testing. That is the one we've struggled with the most. We've got a bunch of physical, mechanical interactives that we are desperate to test on visitors, which we can't right now. But some ways that we have been involved in is peer review. So we've had audience researchers send us through their prototypes that we could maybe play online, or we could look at screen grabs, and we could give our comments from our years of doing prototype testing. So that could be one way of utilizing the expertise in the area. There are some online platforms that you can try. And again, we'll link to those in the Google Drive. Other things we've talked about is if we do get back on site and are able to visit to prototype test, but in a socially distanced way, are there ways in which we could use staff, or perhaps the audience researcher could be directed by the visitor to actually do the interactions physically themselves. So these are some of the things that we are thinking about, and I'd love to know what you are thinking about as you think about audience research back in your institutions. That's it in terms of our slides, but this is now an opportunity for you to do to ask us any questions. We've got loads coming through on the Q&A. If we could bring back Volker at this point, that would be great. And I will start looking at what are those pertinent questions. Jeremy, your mic is muted, I think.
Brad had muted me in case I did not mute myself. So thank you, Brad. That was a good show there. I was as I was looking, I saw someone ask about doing interviews, and I love interviews. I love that the rich qualitative data that we can get from them. And Volker, you spoke a little bit to this during your presentation. My questions, beside, even if you're keeping distance, you're wearing a mask, hopefully, and there's so much that's communicated for many of us. Even if we're introverts, we might put on our extrovert hat briefly when doing interviews. Whenever you have your mask on, so much of the communication we would normally use to show that we value the visitors' opinions, their views, their perceptions, they're completely opaque. They can't tell. Never mind, I think it does add another layer, potential layer of that cognitive load that I mentioned. So even if the data were going to be reliable, we might not. I have serious questions as to even whether to do interviews face to face.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. Now, Volker, one for you, very popular question. Have you seen a lot of interest in people wanting to visit your museum after being locked down, or are people a bit more hesitant or afraid to be in these public spaces?
It seems to me they are a bit hesitant just to enter cultural places because of the safety, and they are not really sure what to do, because I think it's a general political climate in Germany at least, and because many people are a bit confused because they don't know what to do or what not to do. It's not clear. So it is also the situation for the cultural places, but it's more my personal impression. It's not any representative database opinion.
And Volker, is the decision to open your museum financially viable?
No, it's not financially viable. It's more a political thing, because it is so to say an order of the government, of the local government of Berlin, just to open schools and cultural institutions in a way that the situation is controlled. But it has nothing to do with the money. Although I heard that many museums in Berlin, they have a bit of trouble with the income loss of the lack of visitors, of course. But it's more a political question at the moment.
And how do you balance inclusivity with those safety measures you've introduced? So, for example, if you've got online only tickets, what do you do about those people who might be digitally excluded?
This is a real big problem, and to be honest, there is, as far as I know, there is no solution at the moment. But you have to consider the situation is quite new, and now we have really to adapt to the new situation and find out how to get along with it. But this problem is a big issue, as Jerry mentioned, with the homeschooling, that there are some students are really in a disadvantage, often of a lower average group of the population, for example.
Thank you. And Jeremy, a question for you from Gary. Are you being too idealistic about research in a time when museums are in a financial crisis? They need the help of sponsors and donors more than ever. I don't know if you can see the question there, and I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that one.
Sure. I probably am injecting some optimism, which people that know me would be shocked, potentially. But what I'm hoping with, and Gary, you're entirely correct, this is a funder and sponsor situation too. I'm hoping that if we bring these resources to the funders, to our executives, that they will adjust some of their requirements, some of their expectations. It's, again, about balancing those contexts. And that doesn't just include the visitors' context, it includes balancing our organizational contexts. So I'm hoping, maybe optimistically, that most funders will cut museums, informal learning organizations some slack, give unrestricted funds instead of having to have every funding opportunity tied to 15 different outcomes, most of which cannot be reliably measured at this time.
Sure. Thank you. And just to sort of finish up as we're reaching 3 o'clock, there's a lot of questions around the practicalities of those operational considerations. You know, are you using PPE, hand sanitizer, and so on? In the Google Drive, in the document called Museums Reopening, you've got links there to loads of different guidelines and guidance that is out there, including from Ecsite. And as I mentioned, Ben Mellum has been collating what different museums across the globe are putting in practice in terms of those operational considerations. So do have a look at that resource, and do feel free to add and share anything that you come across.
Marie, if I could, there was another question from Gary. Will there be greater collaboration between all museums and centers because of the challenge of COVID-19? I wonder if Ecsite's role, and maybe Aztec and AMA, among others, to be more critical in facilitating this kind of interaction. Maybe some opportunities to work together on interactive offerings versus duplicating efforts. Is this realistic to imagine? I know here in the US there are several efforts as well. Some of those are being done by some of the sentiment trackers we mentioned that listed earlier. One of the important things to, even if you're following the equitable evaluation framework, some of these things that I've suggested, and you're participating in one of these efforts, you might not get data that directly relates to your situation, to your specific museum. You might, many times it's broken down regionally, because the museums will share that information, like the mailing lists, and reach out one time. They have the database, the secure database. They'll reach out one time to the member. So that member might respond and with thinking of one particular organization, but they might be, like me, members of multiple local museums. So even with these collaborative efforts, there will be significant overlap, but it's not, we need to, as museums, as organizations, adjust our expectations as well.
Great.
So, hey everybody, it's Brad again. I thought I'd jump back in because we are quickly running out of time. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank our 3 amazing speakers for today, Jeremy, Volker, and of course, Marie. So let's kind of give them a virtual round of applause from wherever you are.
Thank you.
And Marie, I know you've pulled this together at a time when you were probably doing extra duty at the museum, so we really appreciate that extra time. For all those questions that haven't been answered, I'll get Marie and the team to have a look through and to find a way to respond through Ecsite. And with that all said and done, do please look at Ecsite online and try and join in on as many webinars as possible, and do join us for that very special Ecsite Day in June. And with that all said and done, stay safe, and lovely to see you virtually, and hopefully we'll all see each other again very soon. Take care.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you.
Thank you.